One question has puzzled me ever since I became a procurement consultant 26 years ago. Why do CEOs pay so little attention to procurement? I may not have the full answer, but I believe it has a lot to do with Henry Ford. This is the first episode of a mini-series on the history of procurement. If you want to catch future episodes, please subscribe and hit that bell icon. The short answer to my question is that management theory came before suppliers really were seen. The long version of the answer comes in this video. Let's get started. The modern story of procurement begins a little over 100 years ago when Henry Ford was dealing with the consequences of World War I. At this point in time, the farm boy turned self-made millionaire was already running his automotive company. In 1908, 6 years before the outbreak of the war, Ford had unveiled his super successful car, the Model T. It very clearly delivered on his promise to build a car for the great multitude. It was affordable, simple to drive and simple to fix for any capable farmhand, if it ever broke at all. Also, it was quite simple to make. As Ford once said, any customer can have a car painted any color that he wants so long as it is black. For the first few years, Ford enjoyed remarkable success. He was heavily influenced by Frederick Taylor, the architect of scientific management. Ford even hired Taylor as a consultant to observe his workers and develop ways for the company to become more efficient and productive. By 1914, Ford's new assembly line at Highland Park in Detroit was churning out one Model T car every 93 minutes. But with the outbreak of war, Ford ran into difficulties. In particular, he struggled to get access to raw materials he needed to build his cars. For example, the rubber he needed for the Model T's tires came from what is now Sri Lanka, and the supply was monopolized by the British, who were embroiled in the conflict. These problems compounded an already existing problem: the sharp practices of his suppliers. This was a time when capitalism was red in tooth and claw. Yes, the heydays of the robber barons were over. The railroad king, Cornelius Vanderbilt, was long since dead. The steel magnate, Andrew Carnegie, had retired to Scotland, and John Rockefeller had seen his energy giant Standard Oil broken up. But trust, the invisible force that binds people together in a productive partnership, was still a rare commodity. So in this volatile environment, Ford decided to take control of everything from raw materials to producing the finished goods. In other words, he decided to take ownership of the entire supply chain. This was a bold ambition. Until then, Ford had been an assembler, putting together handcrafted components produced by specialist suppliers such as the Dodge brothers, who later founded their own car brand. Now, Henry Ford went out and bought his own rubber plantation in the jungles of Brazil, creating a little town called Fordlandia. Also, he acquired coalfields, iron ore mines and timberlands, as well as a fleet of ships and a railroad to transport the raw materials to his factory. Eventually, in 1927, he built his own enormous steelworks, parts manufacturer and assembly line at River Rouge, not far from Detroit. This strategy, now known as vertical integration, transformed the fortunes of the company and turned Henry Ford into the richest man in the world. But of course, it meant that there was simply no need for procurement professionals because there was nothing to procure. Ford had everything he needed to build his Model T. There were some significant drawbacks to this strategy, however. First, it was costly. Second, it was bureaucratic, making Ford less agile than some of his competitors. As a result, by the early 1930s, Ford was only the third biggest car maker, having been overtaken by General Motors and Chrysler. It took another war for Ford to think about a different approach. In January 1942, just a few weeks after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, the United States established the War Production Board. Its purpose was to take command of America's supply chain, controlling the distribution of essential materials and converting factories into manufacturing plants for planes, tanks, armored vehicles and other military equipment. At a stroke of a pen, With the US government acting as a kind of honest broker, trust that had been lacking was restored to the economic system. Over the next 3 years, American factories became the arsenal of democracy. Such was the so-called miracle of conversion that the country's automobile industry turned out only 139 cars between 1942 to 1945, compared with 3 million cars in 1941. Ford's industrial might was put to good effect, and the company produced B-24 Liberator bombers at the rate of 1 per hour at its plant at Willow Run. The Washington Post called it the greatest single manufacturing plant the world has ever seen. But the biggest corporate winner was Ford's rival, General Motors. It was the single biggest wartime manufacturer, given government contracts worth $14 billion. In comparison, Ford only received contracts worth $5 billion. It was no coincidence that Peter Drucker chose GM as the subject for his pioneering study of corporate organizations that led to the creation of schools of management across America. As Drucker put it, GM was then the star performer in the American production achievement of World War II. Moreover, the automotive industry, of which General Motors was the worldwide leader, was the outstanding high-tech industry of those days. Under the guidance of Alfred Sloan, the president and CEO, GM developed a variation on the theme of vertical integration. He created what has been called captive suppliers, independent divisions such as AC Spark Plug and Harrison Radiator. The idea was to have all the benefits of a vertically integrated company and at the same time the benefits of the free market on cost and efficiency. And yes, this is the very Alfred Sloan who funded or founded MIT's Sloan School of Management. Meanwhile, Ford sought to learn from the war experience. Across America, many of the key military personnel walked into lucrative corporate jobs. Foremost among these were 10 US Air Force officers Ford hired in 1946. They had been part of the elite statistical control unit that was established to help expand the bombing rates in Europe, North Africa, and the Pacific. Let loose on Ford's vast River Rouge complex, they subjected the company to a ruthlessly rational examination. How did the organization work? How were cars built? Why were these components used? When they arrived, Ford was almost a loss-making operation. The following year, profit shot up to $65 million, and by 1949 that had tripled. The standout former Air Force officer was Robert McNamara. He eventually became Ford's president, and he might have remained at the firm for the rest of his career had Kennedy not appointed him US Secretary of Defense in 1961. In the 1950s, Ford really broke with its past by outsourcing the manufacture of some key components to a series of specialist suppliers. In a sense, Ford was going back to its roots as an assembler. But the seeds had been planted before. Management theory, as developed by luminaries like Taylor, Drucker and Sloan, assumed largely vertically integrated companies. These companies would buy raw materials or commodities, but most of the processing and value adding toward final products would be done internally. In this academic tradition, finance, sales, manufacturing, engineering and logistics were the dominant function. Without meaningful suppliers, there simply is not much room for procurement. There you have it. For Ford and GM, the 1950s and 1960s were smooth sailing. But just as they were starting to consolidate the leadership, they were knocked back by a new external shock. Not war this time, but the energy crisis of the early 1970s. We will cover that period in my next video in this mini-series on the history of procurement. If you like this video, please leave a like and subscribe to my channel. If you want to ensure that you get notified of the next video, hit that bell icon. Thank you for watching and I see you in the next one. Bye!